Picture this. You've just received the most coveted invitation in all of Europe. The golden seal bears the fleur-de-lis, and your hands tremble as you break the wax. You're invited to the Palace of Versailles, the most magnificent court in the world, where kings and queens dine on gold plates and sleep in beds worth more than entire villages. But here's what no history book will tell you about that dream invitation. The moment you step through those legendary Hall of Mirrors, past the crystal chandeliers that cost more than a small kingdom's treasury, you'd be struck by something so shocking, so absolutely revolting, that you'd question everything you thought. You knew about royal glamour. The stench would hit you like a physical blow. Imagine the most putrid combination of rotting food, human waste, unwashed bodies, and rancid animal fat, all trapped within marble walls and carried through corridors by servants who've learned to breathe through their mouths. This wasn't just an occasional problem, this was daily life at the world's most envied palace. Welcome to the horrifying reality behind the silk curtains and jeweled tiaras. Today, we're pulling back those velvet drapes to expose 5 hygiene practices so disgusting, so unthinkably vile, that they'll make you grateful for every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted. And trust me, by the time we reach number 1, you'll never look at royal portraits the same way again. But before we dive into this cesspool of aristocratic filth, ask yourself this. What would you sacrifice for ultimate power and prestige? Because these royal women, the most envied females in history, paid a price that would make your skin crawl. Let's start with something that might seem innocent enough. Taking a bath. You hop in the shower every morning without a second thought, right? Well, prepare to have your mind blown. Because royal women in 17th century France treated bathing like we treat playing with venomous snakes. Here's the twisted logic that governed their lives. The most brilliant medical minds of the age, and we're talking about doctors, who advised kings and queens, genuinely believed that warm water was a gateway to death. Not discomfort, not inconvenience, actual death. Dr. Simon Buddock, personal physician to Louis XIV, wrote extensive treatises on how hot water violently opens the pores, creating highways for pestilence to march directly into the bloodstream. These weren't quacks or village healers. These were the Harvard Medical School graduates of their time. And they were absolutely convinced that a warm bath could kill you faster than poison. But the medical establishment wasn't the only enemy of cleanliness. The Catholic Church wielded even more terrifying power over these women's daily lives. Bishops delivered sermons describing bathhouses as temples of vanity, where women worship their own flesh instead of God. Public bathing was associated with prostitution, and even private bathing was seen as an act of dangerous self-indulgence that could corrupt a woman's soul. So, what did the most powerful women in Europe do when they needed to clean themselves? Brace yourself for this. They used what they called dry cleaning. Picture Marie Antoinette, draped in silk worth more than a merchant's lifetime earnings, taking a cloth barely dampened with wine vinegar or brandy and giving herself what amounted to the world's most expensive baby wipe bath. These weren't even water-soaked cloths. The liquid of choice was often alcohol because it evaporated quickly and didn't dangerously open the pores. Some women used their own saliva, believing it had purifying properties. The Duchess of Orleans, sister-in-law to the Sun King himself, wrote in her personal letters about using rose water mixed with white wine to wipe down her face and hands, but admitted she hadn't touched her body with any liquid in over 3 months. And when these royal women did bathe maybe 3 or 4 times a year during major religious festivals, it was a family affair that would horrify any modern germaphobe. The entire household would use the same tub of water. And guess who went last? That's right. The women. By the time a duchess or countess stepped into that communal bath, she was essentially marinating in the combined dirt, sweat, and bodily fluids of everyone who'd gone before her. The water would be cold, murky, and floating, with things you don't want to imagine. Some accounts describe the water as being so thick with filth that bathers could barely see their own feet. Lady Elizabeth Charlotte, Princess Palatine, documented one particularly nightmarish communal bath, where the water had turned completely black, and she could feel unspeakable things floating against her skin. She wrote, "I emerged dirtier than when I entered, but custom demanded I declare myself refreshed." The psychological impact was devastating. These women, raised to believe they were divine representations of beauty and grace, knew they reeked. They wrote private letters describing their shame, their constant awareness of their own stench, and their desperate attempts to mask it with increasingly elaborate perfumes and powders. The famous Madame de Maintenon, secret wife of Louis XIV, confessed in her private journals that she sometimes wept from the humiliation of her own body odor, especially during intimate moments with the king. She described feeling like a beautiful flower that had rotted from within. Yet she couldn't break free from the medical and religious constraints that kept her from the one thing that could help: a simple bath. The irony is staggering. These women spent fortunes on silk stockings that would be discarded after one wearing. Yet they couldn't spend a single afternoon properly washing their own bodies. They were prisoners of their own status, trapped in a cycle of filth by the very experts they trusted most. Now, if you thought the bathing situation was bad, wait until you hear about their approach to basic human waste management. This is where things get so disgusting that you might want to pause and grab some fresh air. Because what I'm about to tell you about the Palace of Versailles will change how you see every historical drama forever. The Palace of Versailles, with its 2,300 rooms and capacity for over 10,000 courtiers, nobles, and servants, had exactly, are you ready for this? Fewer than a dozen actual toilets. Not per floor, not per wing in the entire palace. Let that sink in for a moment. 10,000 people, 12 toilets. So what did everyone else do when nature called? This is where the story takes a turn that's simultaneously hilarious and absolutely horrifying. The solution was what they called chaises percees, literally pierced chairs, which were essentially chamber pots disguised as furniture. But here's where it gets really disturbing. These weren't private bathroom stalls. These portable toilets were used wherever and whenever the need arose. Court etiquette actually included rules about proper defecation behavior during formal events. Ladies would discreetly step behind a curtain or into an alcove, do their business in a chamber pot. And then, this is the part that will make you gag. A servant would dump the contents out the nearest window. Marie-Jeanne Lebrunce de Beaumont, a governess at Versailles, wrote detailed accounts of her time there, and she describes the morning ritual where dozens of chamber pots would be emptied simultaneously from the palace windows. She called it the daily rainfall of shame, and noted that walking the palace grounds before noon was virtually impossible due to the hazardous conditions. But it wasn't just chamber pots. The palace corridors themselves became toilets. Men openly urinated in corners, behind tapestries, and even in the famous Hall of Mirrors during crowded receptions. Women, bound by slightly more rigid etiquette, would lift their massive skirts and relieve themselves against the walls of side passages. Often during the middle of formal court presentations, the Swedish ambassador, Count Nils Bilk, wrote a report back to his king that described Versailles as a palace of golden chamber pots, where the most refined ladies in Europe squat in corners like peasants, yet continue their conversations about philosophy and art without missing a beat. What's truly mind-boggling is how normalized this became. Court ladies would interrupt their card games to use a chamber pot behind a decorative screen, continue their conversation throughout the process, and then seamlessly return to their gambling as if nothing had happened. They developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms and hand signals to communicate bathroom needs without breaking social protocols. The Duchess of Burgundy famously gave birth to a future heir to the French throne while simultaneously using a chamber pot, because court etiquette demanded that royal births be witnessed by multiple nobles. But nobody had thought to provide proper sanitation facilities for the process. And let's talk about cleanup, shall we? Toilet paper didn't exist, so people used whatever was available: fabric scraps, leaves brought in from the gardens, straw from horse stables, or in desperate situations, their own clothing. Washing afterward was minimal at best, and often non-existent. The palace employed an entire department of servants whose only job was waste management, and they were considered the lowest class of workers in the entire hierarchy. These poor souls would cart wheelbarrows full of human excrement through the same halls where kings held court, often during active social events. By 1715, the smell had become so overwhelming that King Louis XIV issued a royal decree not banning public defecation, mind you, but requiring that the corridors be cleaned once per week. Once per week. This was considered a major hygiene improvement. The psychological impact on the women was devastating. Imagine being dressed in a gown worth more than most people's homes, your hair arranged by master stylists, your jewelry sparkling with precious stones, and having to excuse yourself to squat behind a tapestry in full view of the most important people in Europe. The humiliation was constant and unavoidable. Madame de Sévigné wrote letters to her daughter describing the crushing indignity of royal life, where she was expected to maintain perfect composure while her body's most basic needs were treated as public spectacles. She confessed to restricting her food and water intake before important court events, trying to minimize her bathroom needs, which only made her feel weak and lightheaded during crucial social moments. The health consequences were predictably catastrophic. Urinary tract infections were universal among court women, kidney stones were common, and the constant exposure to human waste created perfect conditions for cholera, dysentery, and parasitic infections that would sweep through the palace like wildfire. The hair horror show just when you think we've reached the depths of royal hygiene hell. We encounter something so spectacularly disgusting that it deserves its own category. In the annals of human folly, their hair care practices, and I use the term care very, very loosely. The hairstyles of 17th and 18th century royal women weren't just fashion statements. They were architectural marvels that defied gravity, common sense, and basic sanitation. We're talking about hair, constructions that rose to sometimes 3 feet above a woman's head, decorated with everything from miniature windmills to fully rigged sailing ships, complete with tiny cannons and working sails. But here's the horror you never learned in history class. These magnificent hair sculptures were never, ever washed. Not the hair, not the decorations, not the structural supports. Never. Let me paint you the full picture of how these monstrosities were created. Because the process itself was a descent into madness. First, the woman's natural hair would be teased, twisted, and tortured into the base structure. Then, horsehair, human hair bought from peasants, wool padding, and wire frameworks would be added to create the proper height and shape. The whole structure was then cemented together using pomade and, when I say pomade, I mean rancid animal fat. Bear grease was the luxury option, but most women used beef tallow, pork lard, or whatever animal fat their servants could acquire. This wasn't a small amount, either. These hairstyles required pounds of grease to hold their shape. Now picture this, a towering sculpture of human hair, animal hair, and rancid animal fat, worn for weeks or even months without removal. In the heat of crowded ballrooms, with candles flickering inches away from these grease-soaked monuments, what do you think happened? The lice infestations were legendary. Not just a few bugs, we're talking about entire civilizations of parasites living in these women's hair. The Countess of Polignac, Marie Antoinette's best friend, wrote in her diary about feeling her scalp alive with movement during an important state dinner. She described the sensation as thousands of tiny feet dancing across my skull. But etiquette demanded she smile and continue her conversation about literature. Court ladies carried special scratching implements, ornate silver or gold tools that looked like tiny hands on long handles. These were called head scratchers, and they were as essential to a lady's accessories as her fan or her jewelry. You can see them in formal portraits, held delicately in jeweled fingers, because the need to scratch was so constant that it became part of their pose. But the lice were just the beginning. The combination of old animal fat, unwashed hair, and warm scalp conditions created perfect breeding grounds for all manner of creatures. Beetles, moths, and other insects would actually build nests in these hairstyles. The Duchess of Devonshire once found a family of mice that had taken up residence in her towering coiffure, complete with a nest of babies. The smell was indescribable. Imagine rancid butter mixed with unwashed hair, dead insects, and whatever. Creatures had died and decomposed in the hidden recesses of these hair mountains. The stench was so overwhelming that ladies carried special perfumed handkerchiefs to hold over their noses, not to smell pretty, but to avoid fainting from their own hair odor. Some women developed serious scalp infections from the constant presence of parasites and rotting organic matter. Boils, rashes, and open sores were common. The weight of these hairstyles, sometimes exceeding 15 pounds, caused chronic neck pain, headaches, and spinal problems. Several court ladies developed permanent neck deformities from years of supporting these monsters on their heads. The fire danger was constant and real. The combination of animal grease, hair powder, which was highly flammable, and proximity to candles created regular hair fires. The Countess de Pilastrin suffered severe burns when her hairstyle caught fire during a birthday celebration for the Dauphin. She survived, but her scalp was permanently scarred, and she had to wear wigs for the rest of her life. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the psychological torture these women endured. They couldn't sleep properly because lying down would destroy their hairstyles. They had to sleep sitting up in special chairs, often for weeks at a time, getting maybe 2 or 3 hours of rest per night. The sleep deprivation, combined with the constant physical discomfort and social pressure, drove many court ladies to the edge of mental breakdown. Marie Antoinette's personal hairstylist, Leonard Outy, left detailed records of his work, and his accounts read like horror stories. He described finding dead rats, bird nests, and once an entire family of cockroaches living in the hair of the Duchess of Chartres. He wrote about the tears of relief women would shed when their hairstyles were finally dismantled, and their first glimpse of their own scalp after months of imprisonment. The social pressure was relentless. To appear at court with a simple hairstyle was social suicide. These women were literally poisoning themselves, harboring diseases, and enduring constant agony to maintain their status. They were prisoners of their own hair, trapped in sculptures of vanity that slowly destroyed their health and sanity. The kitchen catastrophe. We venture into territory so stomach-churning that it might actually make you lose your appetite for days. We're talking about the food preparation and dining practices that turned every royal meal into a potential death sentence. Because if you think the modern food safety standards are strict, wait until you hear what passed for fine dining at the most prestigious court in Europe. The royal kitchens at Versailles were architectural marvels, employing hundreds of the most skilled chefs, pastry artists, and food craftsmen in the world. These kitchens produced meals so elaborate and beautiful that they were considered works of art. But lurking behind those golden platters and crystal goblets was a sanitation nightmare that would make a medieval peasant's hovel look sterile by comparison. Here's the first horrifying detail. The palace's plumbing system was so catastrophically inadequate that raw sewage regularly backed up into the food preparation areas, not occasionally regularly. The head cook for Queen Marie Lecziewska documented in his kitchen logs that they dealt with sewage overflow in the main preparation area at least twice per week. Picture this scene: master chefs preparing delicate pastries for a state dinner, while literal human waste bubbles up through the floor drains around their feet. The kitchen staff would simply move their workstations to higher shelves and continue cooking, because cancelling a royal meal was unthinkable, regardless of the contamination. The meat storage was equally horrifying. Without proper refrigeration, massive quantities of beef, pork, poultry, and game were stored in underground chambers that were supposed to stay cool. But these chambers were also connected to the same failing sewer system. Meat would sit for days in pools of contaminated water, developing a greenish tinge and an overwhelming stench the kitchen staff learned to ignore. Marie-Antoine Carême, who would later become the world's first celebrity chef, started his career in the Versailles kitchens as a young apprentice. His memoirs describe the green room, where spoiled meat was stored and still used in cooking. He wrote about learning to scrape mold and maggots off of roasts before sending them to the royal table, because waste was considered a greater sin than poisoning. The pest situation was beyond catastrophic. Rats, mice, cockroaches, and other vermin had free run of the kitchens. But here's the truly disturbing part. The kitchen staff developed recipes that incorporated pest droppings as flavor enhancers, what they couldn't remove. They learned to cook with, telling themselves that proper seasoning could mask any unpleasant tastes. But let's talk about the water supply, shall we? The water used for cooking and food preparation came from the same sources that were contaminated by the palace's waste disposal system. Kitchen staff would boil water to make it safe, but they were essentially making soup from diluted sewage. The head chef's assistant, Jean-Baptiste Lavarenne, left detailed records showing that kitchen workers had a life expectancy roughly half that of other palace servants, primarily due to the constant exposure to contaminated water and food. The consequences for the royal diners were predictably horrific. Gastrointestinal illness was so common among courtiers that they had special etiquette rules for dining while suffering from diarrhea and vomiting. Ladies learned to excuse themselves discreetly when sudden illness struck, but they were expected to return to the table and continue eating, even if they were clearly suffering. Parasitic infections were universal. Every single member of the royal court was infected with intestinal worms of various types. The royal physicians' records show that deworming treatments were administered to courtiers as routinely as we might take vitamins today. Louis XIV himself passed a tapeworm that measured over 6 feet in length, and his personal doctor preserved it in alcohol as a medical curiosity. But here's perhaps the most disturbing detail. The royal women were expected to maintain their elegant dining performance even while battling serious foodborne illnesses. The Duchess of Maine wrote about dining with severe stomach cramps, forcing herself to smile and engage in witty conversation while feeling as if wild animals were clawing at my insides. The psychological torture was immense. These women knew the food was dangerous, could smell the contamination, and could see the vermin, but refusing to eat was not an option. Court etiquette demanded that they accept whatever was placed before them with grace and apparent pleasure, even if they suspected it might kill them. Marie Antoinette's personal letters reveal the constant fear she lived with around meal times. She describes trying to eat as little as possible during formal dinners, then sneaking simple bread and cheese in her private chambers afterward. But even this wasn't safe. Her private food supplies were stored in the same contaminated areas and prepared by the same compromised kitchen staff. The ripple effects extended beyond physical illness. The chronic malnutrition from avoiding dangerous foods, combined with the constant poisoning from foods they did eat, left many court women in a state of perpetual weakness and mental fog. They were literally being slowly poisoned by the very luxury that was supposed to demonstrate their elevated status. Some women tried to protect themselves by employing food tasters, but even this precaution was problematic. The food tasters were typically lower status servants who were considered expendable. If they fell ill or died from contaminated food, it was seen as proof that the system was working, not as a sign that the food was too dangerous to serve. Finally, we arrive at what might be the most emotionally devastating and physically traumatic aspect of royal women's lives: giving birth. Under conditions that would make a modern emergency room look like a luxury spa. This isn't just about medical ignorance or lack of technology. This is about the systematic dehumanization of women during their most vulnerable moments. When a royal woman went into labor, word would spread through the palace like wildfire, and within hours, her delivery room would transform into what can only be described as a medieval amphitheater. We're not talking about a few close family members, we're talking about crowds of 50, 60, sometimes over 100 people crammed into a space barely large enough for 10. The official witness list for royal births read like a who's who of European nobility, foreign ambassadors, church officials, court physicians, noble witnesses, government ministers, and dozens of courtiers all claimed the right to be present. The reasoning was supposedly to prevent fraud, to ensure that no stillborn baby was swapped for a healthy one, no female child replaced with a male heir. But the reality was far more sinister. These births had become public entertainment. Marie Antoinette's first delivery is perhaps the most documented horror show in royal history. Her labor room was packed so tightly with observers that several people fainted from the heat and lack of air. The Queen herself passed out multiple times, not just from the pain of childbirth, but from the suffocating atmosphere created by hundreds of unwashed bodies pressing in to get a better view of her most intimate moments. But here's what makes this even more horrifying. The medical understanding of the time demanded that these women give birth fully clothed in elaborate gowns, surrounded by heavy curtains and tapestries that trapped heat and blocked air circulation. They couldn't remove their restrictive corsets, couldn't position themselves comfortably, and couldn't even cry out in pain without violating court etiquette. The Duchess of Burgundy, who gave birth to 3 future kings of France, left a private diary that describes the absolute terror she felt when labor began. She writes, "The moment the pains started, I knew I was no longer a person, but a public exhibition. My body belonged to France, my suffering belonged to the court, and my dignity belonged to no one." The medical care was not just inadequate, it was actively harmful. Court physicians believed that a woman's screams during childbirth were a sign of moral weakness and potentially dangerous to the baby. So laboring mothers were given leather straps to bite down on, effectively silencing them during one of the most painful experiences a human can endure. The treatments these women endured during labor read like a catalogue of medieval torture. They were bled with leeches to balance their humors, given enemas with wine and herbs to cleanse their systems, and forced to drink concoctions made from ground pearls and gold leaf that were supposed to ease delivery, but actually caused severe poisoning. Dr. Mesnard, the royal obstetrician, kept detailed records of his procedures, and they reveal a level of medical malpractice that's almost impossible to comprehend. He regularly performed what he called assistance procedures that involved inserting unsterilized instruments into laboring women to speed up delivery. For the convenience of the watching crowd, these interventions caused massive infections that killed numerous royal mothers in the days following successful births. The mortality rates were staggering. Roughly 1 in 3 royal infants died within their first year, and maternal mortality was nearly as high. But here's the most heartbreaking detail. When a mother died in childbirth, court etiquette demanded that the witnesses remain for the formal documentation process, which could take hours. The dead woman's body would lie in the same room where she had just given birth, surrounded by the same crowd that had watched her die, while clerks prepared the official death documents. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the delivery room. Royal women lived in constant terror of pregnancy, knowing that each conception was essentially a death sentence that would be carried out in front of an audience. Many developed severe anxiety disorders, depression, and what we would now recognize as PTSD from their childbirth experiences. The Countess of Artois, who survived for public deliveries, wrote in her final letter before taking her own life, "I have been violated by medicine, humiliated by protocol, and tortured by duty. My children were born into the world through a gauntlet of shame that no woman should endure. I pray that future generations will never know such degradation in the name of royal blood." But perhaps most disturbing of all was the normalization of this horror. These women were taught from childhood that public childbirth was an honor, a privilege that came with their elevated status. They were conditioned to be grateful for the attention, to see the witnessing crowd as validation of their importance, rather than violation of their humanity. The ripple effects lasted for generations. Many royal women who survived these ordeals developed such severe birth trauma that they could never be intimate with their husbands again. Others became obsessed with control over their own bodies, leading to eating disorders, self-harm, and other destructive behaviors as they desperately tried to reclaim some sense of personal autonomy. So there you have it, 5 horrifying truths that shatter every romantic notion you might have had about royal life. In history's most glamorous court, these women, for all their silks and jewels, their palaces and privileges, lived lives of constant humiliation, physical torment, and psychological torture that would break most modern people. Within days, the next time you see a painting of a beautiful duchess in flowing gowns, remember that she's probably crawling with lice, hasn't bathed in months, recently used a chamber pot in public, just ate contaminated food that will make her violently ill, and is dreading her next pregnancy because she knows it could kill her in front of a cheering crowd. These weren't just the side effects of living in a different time. These were the direct consequences of a social system that valued appearance over humanity, status over health, and tradition over basic human dignity. The real tragedy isn't just what these women endured, but how completely they were convinced that their suffering was not only normal, but enviable. The golden age of absolute monarchy came with a price that was paid in flesh, dignity, and human suffering on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. Behind every glittering ballroom scene, every